All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a seriously provocative piece of political analysis by Rigoberto Tiglao. We're looking at these recent, honestly shocking realignments in the Philippine Senate. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, it's basically a masterclass in how decades-old political blood feuds can be seemingly erased almost overnight just for the sake of power. It's wild. Let's see exactly how Tiglao deconstructs the whole shebang. To keep things completely impartial with such charged material, we're going to break this down step by step. First, the Marcos-Aquino rivalry. Then the shifting Senate alliances, the core betrayal accusation, the alternative path, and finally, the movement's final nail.
Okay, starting with Section 1, the Marcos-Aquino rivalry setting the historical baseline.
According to Tiglao, to really grasp the sheer gravity of what's happening in the Senate today, you've got to look at the history. The Liberal Party, basically the Aquino establishment, built its entire post-war identity on a very deep, very real historical wound. We're talking about the 1971 Plaza Miranda bombing that literally shredded their senatorial slate. Then, the 1972 padlocking of Congress and the jailing of Ninoy Aquino. And of course, the assassination of Ninoy on the tarmac in 1983. Tiglao points out that because of these absolutely seismic events, the Liberal Party didn't just view the Marcos family as political opponents, they were the arch-enemy. This was their founding creed, you know?
Which brings us to a quote that brilliantly captures the central thesis of Tiglao's column. He writes, "For its senators now to steady a Marcos presidency is not a routine realignment, it is a desecration." Think about that word, desecration. Tiglao is arguing that today's Aquino heirs aligning with the Marcos administration isn't just everyday run-of-the-mill politics. From his perspective, it's an absolute unforgivable offense to the very spirit of Ninoy and Cory Aquino.
Moving on to Section 2, Senate alliances and how the math shifted. Now, what's really fascinating here is how Tiglao breaks down the actual chronological progression. Back on May 11th, when Senate President Tito Sotto was ousted, the Marcos administration bloc was actually a tiny minority, just 6 senators. But then, the Aquino bloc joined in, bumping their numbers up to 9. And that sudden momentum? Well, it easily attracted fence-sitters like Zubiri and Ejercito, pushing the bloc to 11. Finally, 2 defections from Escudero and Villanueva secured a 13-seat majority. Tiglao emphasizes that it was the Aquino bloc's initial move that deliberately snowballed this distinct minority into a ruling majority. But here's the real paradox that Tiglao points out. This growing Senate alliance happened at the exact same time the Marcos administration's satisfaction ratings were practically nosediving. According to the Social Weather Station's poll, the administration dropped from a net positive 14 in November 2025 all the way down to a negative 13 by March. So ironically enough, the Aquino bloc ended up propping up the Marcos administration in the Senate at the precise moment public satisfaction was heavily bottoming out. Talk about weird timing, right?
That brings us to Section 3, the core betrayal accusation.
Tiglao really doesn't mince words when it comes to the 3 key figures who facilitated this realignment. First off, he calls out Bam Aquino. Bam is the nephew of Ninoy and Cory, and Tiglao notes that he literally invoked his family's legacy, even styling himself to look like Ninoy during the 2022 elections, only to now steady a Marcos in Malacanang. Next is Kiko Pangilinan, who just a couple of years ago campaigned passionately as an anti-Marcos vice presidential candidate. And finally, there's Risa Hontiveros. While she's technically from the Akbayan party, Tiglao labels her the most disciplined soldier of the Aquino order. Because she knows exactly what the movement stood for, he claims her silence on this whole alliance amounts to nothing less than quiet treason.
So why did they do it? The author asserts that this wasn't some unavoidable accident of politics. Actually, scratch that. He thinks it was completely deliberate. According to Tiglao, they hid behind silence because the truth is pretty squalid. He argues they voluntarily joined the administration column simply to secure Senate chairmanships, extra compensation, and budget insertions. In his blunt view, they basically chose patronage and perks over taking an honorable, independent path. Next up is Section 4, the alternative path, or the missed opportunity.
So, the big question is, what does Tiglao think they should have done instead? He proposes a really fascinating counterfactual here. If these 3 senators had just stuck to their principles, they could have joined forces with the 5 Duterte senators and their 8 allies who ousted Soto. Together, they would have formed a massive 16-senator independent bloc. To put that into perspective, that's a full 2/3 majority in the Senate, entirely independent of the Marcos administration.
With that kind of solid mandate, Tiglao argues the Senate could have actually functioned as a powerful check and balance, which is, a fundamental pillar of democracy. For instance, he points out they could have pursued a major investigation into this explosive expose by 18 ex-soldiers regarding a ghost flood control scam allegedly tied to the administration. But instead, under the new Marcos-aligned leadership, that investigation has completely stalled out.
Now, Tiglao does acknowledge a potential sort of quiet defense from these senators. They might argue that the Dutertes represent a greater danger, and that Marcos is preferable because he essentially handed Rodrigo Duterte over to the International Criminal Court. But Tiglao counters this defense really sharply. He brings up Duterte's incredibly high exit satisfaction ratings. We're talking an amazing net positive 76 in June 2022. Tiglao argues that if the public truly viewed Duterte's administration as the ultimate evil, the Filipino people simply would not have given him such an overwhelmingly high rating of positive 76 on his way out the door.
And finally, Section 5, the movement's final nail in the potential end of the Yellows.
This next point is arguably the heaviest punch in the entire analysis. Tiglao asserts that this modern alliance exposes the whole historical EDSA mythology as a complete facade. He writes that the war between the Aquino establishment and the Marcoses was never a clash of good and evil, but rather a quarrel between two wings of the same propertied class. When an anti-elite outsider like Duterte appeared, he argues, the establishment just closed ranks. It basically proves that the children of EDSA and the children of martial law are perfectly comfortable standing on the exact same side of the barricade.
Ultimately, Tiglao concludes that this single Senate maneuver absolutely demolished whatever credibility the Yellow movement had left. He paints them as an elite, U.S.-backed group that loudly claims to want reform, but in practice refuses to actually confront the ruling class it benefits from. By voluntarily becoming assets to a Marcos administration, Tiglao argues these senators haven't just pragmatically shifted alliances, they've literally hammered the final nail into the coffin of the Aquino-led movement.
So we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought based on Tiglao's intense analysis. Has a historic, decades-long ideology truly died right there in the halls of the Senate just for the sake of political patronage? Or are we simply watching a new, hyper-pragmatic season of political survival in the Philippines? It's a question that really redefines modern Philippine history. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the narratives behind the politics.